Thank you for tuning in to the only station giving you double the information and inspiration. WDRB Media and WGIV, the soul of Charlotte. This is Meditate and Mingle. I'm your host, Dr. Melissa Tate, a.k.a. Ms. Meditate and Mingle. I have a guest with me here in the studio, Deputy Officer Levins, Eddie Levins.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes. And you're officially retired at this point in 2015.
I retired January 1st of this year. Yes, ma'am.
Congratulations.
Thank you very much.
Here from the Charlotte, the police department.
Yes, ma'am. I did 29 years with the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department.
Awesome. 29. Gosh. I'm still working on that, I guess.
It flies by.
Good stuff. Well, I invited Deputy Officer Levins here. Just in recent weeks, of course, there's been a lot of media coverage about policing in communities all over our nation, and the negativity and the different incidents that are coming up all over the world. But, you know, I became familiar with Officer Levins because of his work with the National Alliance for Mental Illness, and just using the police department as a way to, I guess we want to explain the CIT program, which allows police officers some additional training,
right,
that allows them to partner and kind of recognize mental health in the community, and how to work with those situations that might have more mental illness involved.
Yeah, the concept of CIT was it started out of a program in Memphis, and it's grown across the country, and I think it's like wildfire. People see that the concept works, where you train police officers to identify and respond to people that are in mental health crisis. Mm-hmm. The concept really is so you train officers to the point that they can recognize the situations that people are in, mm-hmm. So they don't over or underreact, mm-hmm. Which quite often leads to some very horrific circumstances.
Absolutely.
And we've seen it across the country where people have been hurt or killed mm-hmm. In interactions with law enforcement, and it really comes about mostly because the officers or the people don't have a relationship or an understanding about what's really going on.
Yeah.
So CIT gives the officers an opportunity to learn about mental illness, mm-hmm. About how people act and respond who are suffering a mental health crisis, mm-hmm. and they can provide a much better police service to these people when they arrive, when they're called to answer that.
Yeah, I like that you said it's like they don't know what's going on with their community, so it kind of allows the police officers to get more in touch with people of the community. What does a training like that look like to understand mental illness? What do the officers have to go through? It
is a 40-hour class that starts out with first identification of mental illness and different various mental health crisis situations. Mm-hmm. It also has some interactive role play, basically, mm-hmm. Throughout mm-hmm. the course, so officers can learn and practice how to respond. Mm-hmm. It also is an opportunity for officers to go out into the community and see what other resources are out there mm-hmm. that are being provided. So when they do encounter somebody, that they can actually give them a way to go. They can give them a place to go, mm-hmm. or they have a contact somewhere, so they can give somebody an opportunity to get some help.
Right. Right. And I know, you and I were talking off air about when I worked for the mobile crisis team in Baltimore City, that we partnered with the Baltimore City Police Department. And it was a really powerful process to be a part of, because, of course, police officers, and some of them honestly came and said, well, I just wanted another training. I just had to, kind of do something. But they really learned something through the process and felt like, wow, I had no idea. I thought I had a cousin that might have been going through something like this. So it just really allowed them to gain some insight about the different mental health disorders that are out there, or different expression of mental health disorders. So we want to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, people in Charlotte-Mecklenburg are extremely fortunate because they have a police department in this community that has so much mental health resources and response resources than any other department that I know of. Mm-hmm. One of the programs that we were just talking about was the Child Development Community Policing Program, which was a service of partnering of mental health professionals with police officers to respond to children and families that are exposed to violence and trauma.
Wow.
So
by that we're talking about domestic dispute in the house, abuse, anything like that?
It could be anything from domestic abuse to street violence to school violence to bullying. Anytime a children is impacted by trauma or violence, it has an effect on them.
Absolutely.
And we actually have been training officers for the past almost 20 years now in Charlotte and throughout several cities in this country about identifying children who are exposed to violence, because we do know, we've learned from our smart friends at Yale University that there is a impact on these children, and quite often it is a negative impact. And unless somebody steps in, and most often it's the police, things won't change.
Yeah.
I give an analogy. It's like if a child breaks their arm, nobody questions whether they should go to the hospital, get it set, put a cast in it. Well, when a child is exposed to trauma or violence, they suffer a mental break.
Yeah.
Why should they be treated any different? Why shouldn't we respond the same? Why shouldn't we give them the same resources? Because we do know that if we respond quickly and with enough resources, that we can make a difference.
Absolutely, absolutely. And of course, having private practice in this area and working with different families and things, I become, I'm on the corrective end, I guess you could say, of children being exposed to trauma, and of course that leads to, a repeat of violence. Sometimes, like you said, mental health issues, whether they go into depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress, all sorts of things. What kind of things do you, when you all come across a call per se, so someone calls 911, there's an emergency, how does a CIT officer respond versus an officer who hasn't been through this training?
Well, I think with any officer that has the extra training that it can identify and recognize the signs and symptoms of someone who is in mental distress, they can provide a better response. It's not probably, it slows things down a little bit.
Okay.
It's not so quick to respond, but they think through this and they try to get the right service to this person who's in need. People don't call the police when they're having the best day of their life.
Yeah, absolutely.
And quite often, when anybody's in crisis, that's the first people that they tend to call. So often, I wish there was other resources in this community that didn't need the police to respond to these situations.
Yeah.
There should be a lot of things that happen before the police get involved. But when you have the officers involved, it's so critical that they do the right thing.
Yeah.
They don't put themselves in unnecessary danger, and they don't put the person in distress in any more danger either.
Yeah. Do you find that you said you wish there were some other resources in place before the police were called? Do you find that there's something missing maybe, or something that could be tweaked a little differently so that the intervention calls aren't necessarily legal issues or criminal or issues?
Well, so often I think this really leads to a discussion about partnerships and how we're all in this together, and
absolutely.
the police, the community, the schools, the churches. Everyone has a role to play. No one can step away and say, well, that's someone else's job. We're all called to deal with situations, and we need to, if we can't deal with it, our responsibility is to find someone who can deal with it. Because if we ignore it, we know what the outcome will be.
Yeah, absolutely.
And quite often it turns out to too often, it's hospital, it's jail, it's death.
Yeah.
And that can be avoided so many times.
Absolutely, absolutely. How often does the unfortunate cases of suicide come your way?
Suicide from in the time before I retired just this year, and then and I've actually spoken to some officers recently.
Yeah.
It is on the rise, and quite often it's the underreported incident because the overdose, there really is a mass suicide.
Yeah.
But what's really eye-opening is the number of adolescent and juvenile suicides that have been occurring that people don't really talk about. What drives a 12-year-old to hang themselves?
Yeah, absolutely.
We really have to educate the community and really have to help the community understand to look for the signs and symptoms so they can get these kids help quicker.
Yeah.
Because we do find when we do intervene, we have better responses.
Absolutely. I came across this article recently about the rise in suicide amongst 5 to 12-year-olds in the African American community. And I'm like, my gosh, what brings a 5-year-old to commit suicide, or a 7-year-old or 8-year-old? I have an 8-year-old at home, so I'm like, that's just staggering. And I work in the field, and I'm familiar with, mental illness. But to see those statistics is really staggering.
It's scary because what we have is, I think, a large part of the community that doesn't want to believe that it happens. So first and foremost, we've got to talk about it.
Absolutely.
It's a very, very hard discussion to have because it's painful, and people don't like to have painful conversations. But this is necessary. It's about protecting these children because so often these children are inundated with things in their community that we may take for granted because we expect it just, it's just the way of life.
Yeah.
Well, trauma and violence is not a way of life for anybody. And so
it shouldn't be. It doesn't have to be.
It doesn't have to be. But we need to all communicate about it. We need to talk about it. If the police officers have an opportunity to talk to, say, teachers and say, if you're over at little Johnny's house the night before and something very horrific happened, wouldn't it be great if the officer spoke to the teacher so they could be aware of what's going on, so when he shows up at school the next day that they can help, that they can apply whatever resources they've got.
Absolutely.
Everybody, it's like a race. We all have to hand the baton off and say, help me. Let's do this together, because at the end we're trying to go to the same thing, which is help individuals and help families.
Absolutely. I think that's an excellent point, is that sometimes I think people work within a vacuum, and I'm doing my job here in this entity, and you're doing your job there in that entity, and the teacher's doing her job there in that entity, and it works so much more comprehensively if we're all working together. Yeah. And I think some of what's missing is the I don't know if it's the time or that extra opportunity to be able to communicate, because how often does a teacher have the opportunity to call the police officer, or a police officer have the time to call the teacher, and the teacher have the time to call them back, or a therapist have time to call the teacher, or the teacher has the time to call them back, I
use the old pay me now, pay me later. We can either give the time and make the time to make this happen, or we can wait for the bad things to happen.
I agree.
And so often is if we put a little bit of effort in now, we will save the effort in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that I'm able to do, or privileged to be able to do, is to talk to parents about having that necessary conversation, that tough conversation. A lot of times, with mental health being such a taboo, and the trauma of the family system being such, my dirty little secret, they're afraid to talk to the teachers because they think that the teacher's going to, maybe call up Child Protective Services, or that the teacher's going to think about their child in a certain sort of way, or frown upon their family. So I definitely want to talk about that a little bit more, about, just the taboo of mental health, and how you got involved with NAMI, and took because you're on the board of...
I just recently got appointed to the board.
Yes, I did my research, officer. I did my research. So we're going to have to take a little break. You are listening to Meditate and Mingle. I'm your host, Dr. Melissa Tate, and you're tuned into WDRB Media and WGIV, the soul of Charlotte. Welcome back to WDRB Media and WGIV, the soul of Charlotte. And welcome to those streaming live through the free TuneIn radio app. You're listening to Meditate and Mingle. I'm your host, Dr. Melissa Tate, in the studio today with Deputy Officer Levins. Do I say that right?
I'm actually a retired deputy chief.
Retired deputy chief. I stand corrected.
That's okay.
But thank you for joining me. So you've been retired just beginning this year of 2015 after serving 29 years in the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department. And we've been talking about the officers taking a special training that assists them in having more knowledge about mental health, mental illness, families that are affected by trauma, and bridging the gap to having those necessary conversations that need to be had so that people are getting the resources they need. One of the things we talked about was just the stigma of mental health in general, and how not having those conversations keep people left without resources. Do you want to talk about your perspective with that a little?
Well, I think the stigma rides so deep with anyone who's victimized, whether it be domestic violence or mental health, or people get embarrassed and they feel like they're the only ones. They feel isolated, so they feel like no one will listen in the first place. But with mental health, I do compare it to any other medical condition, and I really wish we could work really hard to stamp out the stigma of people talking about mental health, because there is no difference between someone having a mental disorder or, say, cancer.
Absolutely.
It is an illness, and if we continue to ignore that, there's probably more people walking around with a mental illness than with cancer.
Probably.
And we have to open this conversation up. We have to give people an out so they have a comfort level to talk about it, so they don't hide in the shadows. Because as long as they hide in the shadows, they'll never get the help they need. Yeah. And quite often, what happens with police officers, they're called in to help people in situations, and they get frustrated because they go, well, why haven't you sought any help for this? Yeah. Well, it's hard. It's not a very easy thing to do, because you have to be vulnerable. You create a vulnerable situation, and
absolutely.
You have to have humility to say, I can't do this myself, and I need help.
And And, frankly speaking, there's so many different type of cultures and family systems that just have swept their little family secrets under the rug, has that uncle or aunt or cousin that they just kind of keep in the house, or if their child has some things, they put them in sports, or they redirect it some other way, and then it gets further complicated by substance abuse because people attempt to self-medicate and not get the help that they need.
That's too often the case, is that they don't know where to go, and there's a fear of where do I go. And I don't think we have a really challenge in this community still of getting the resources available and recognized resources available to people. Because if you ask right now, where do I go? My child is I believe they're suicidal. I believe they're abusing drugs. Yeah. Where do I take them? How do I get any help? It's not easy, short of taking them to the hospital. And where else can you go?
Yeah.
And that shouldn't be the answer.
Very true.
We have clinics on every corner for medical reasons, and why not with mental health? And that's really what's driven me to work with NAMI.
Yeah,
and,
I want to hear more about that.
Throughout my career, I saw too many second and third generation criminal families. Started asking the question, why? What is the common factor that's driving a kid from? Because children aren't born to be criminals. They're not born to victimize people.
Right.
But something happens. Something happens. Something changes, and next thing you know, their way of life becomes a criminal way of life. And where do you stop that? So that's what's kind of led me to this point where I did a lot of research and worked with a lot of very smart people throughout the country who have taught me that the damage you can do to someone's brain at an early age is just like breaking their arm.
Absolutely.
If you don't set it, if you don't put the effort into healing properly, the damage is permanent. And when we ask people, why a child commits a crime as a teenager and then continues on through life, so often you look back, and if you go back in their history, you'll find the circumstances that led them down that path.
Yeah.
And so often those are avoidable. So often someone could have stepped in and redirected them, got them the help they needed at the time, and made a difference and send them up the right path.
Right. I just want to encourage, anyone who's listening that has any thoughts, any worries, any concerns that there might be some sort of, whether there's been in the aftermath of a trauma or you think there might be some mental health difficulties, I always say just ask the questions, go seek out. So I know NAMI has a number of free resources that they offer to the community nationally in any city, wherever you are. You can look up NAMI, NAMI. Here in Charlotte, they offer a lot of free support groups. They offer some family-to-family interventions. And do you want to talk more about any resources they offer?
They're really, if you go to the website NAMI.org and look at the sheer number of resources that are available, and these are, free to families, and the people, the dedicated people that are working with NAMI now, actually reach out to the hospitals and to other mental health organizations and said, we will help.
Yeah.
We'll be part of this solution, and that's why that's led me to NAMI to say we need that resource. We need other people stepping up, saying it. Because what the difference in this community as others is that we also have resources that go out into the field. We have resources that bring the services to the people. If you expect someone to show up at your clinic and tell you all their worst stories or whatever, 9 times out of 10 that's not going to happen. Yeah. You've got to be out there. Yeah. And that's why the resources with the police department, and like I said, you're very fortunate in this community because we currently have a chief of police who understands it, who believes it, and he's built up some very important programs throughout the department over his time here. And I just pray that the next chief does the same thing, that continues on and takes the baton and keeps running this race, because there's so many things we can do better. Yeah. We are better. We're a good department, but if we want to be a great department, we've got to keep pushing this forward.
I think that's an excellent point. Excellent point. I love when people reach out to me and they'll send me an email or they'll just leave me a voicemail just asking questions. I'll answer them all day long, Sure. And so I know that, through Psychology Today, there's a number of therapists that offer just a free consultation. Even if you want to just call and ask questions or send an email and ask a question, say, this is my situation, what do you recommend? And, I again, my resources, you can always find my information on drmetate.com, drmetate.com, and to be able to reach out to my website either via email, or you can give me a call and ask whatever questions you need to ask, just because I think information is power. And you're right. Sometimes it's hard for the conversation to start with email or phone call. At least there's some anonymity there, because it's hard for people to kind of open their door and be vulnerable. And so I wonder about that with the police officers coming out, and sometimes there's some intimidation factors with police officers. How do you work with officers to recognize that their presence isn't always welcomed in those type of situations?
Well, like I said earlier, I think people don't call the police unless they're having probably the worst day of their life. But when you have officers that are trained and aware in how to identify and how to communicate better, they understand that people they're struggling, and they're calling them for a reason. Some of the things that have happened across this country with police relationships and community relationships really has to do with people not knowing each other, people not willing to become friends with somebody and or create relationships with somebody. And that's what was so good about community policing, is that officers in the neighborhoods that got to know people, both the good and the bad. And these walls went up over the past years, and it's got to come down. People have got to reach out and learn who they are, learn who your police officers are in your neighborhood, learn who, and the police officers have a responsibility too to get out of that car, to walk through the neighborhood and get to know people.
Absolutely.
So they're not afraid to call them, because when they do show up and they're really needing help, the officers have such a great responsibility and a great ability to restore a sense of safety and security to someone's life, especially children. And when they do that, they make an impact. They make a positive impact. So the impression of police officers down the road, if I meet a young child today and I may be having to enforce the law, write their parent a ticket or arrest them or whatever. But I take the time to recognize the child's there and to communicate, talk to the child, and build just a basic relationship, so that child has a belief that I can come to this person, and they are a good person for if I need help, I can come to them. And that's what police need to become, is the people that people turn to. It's an awesome responsibility, and there's a lot of people that can't do it. There's a lot of people wearing the uniform that can't do it.
I've been wondering, as you're talking about police officers and their self-care, because they deal with such heavy stuff, dangerous things, walking into very risky situations. So I'm wondering what kind of resources are available for officers in their self-care. What do you recommend as being deputy chief, or having been deputy chief? What do you recommend for your officers to get the self-care that they need?
Like I said, Charlotte is a great place. And CMPD, what they've been able to do is over the last several years, they've recognized the need for both an internal and external mental health response. A team of people who, on the psychological side, can help officers deal with that, because the truth is everyone has a limit. And who knows when you're going to hit that limit. Yeah, absolutely. And we need to protect officers. And when officers have such a close relationship to the job and they see things over and over, yes, they can break too, and we need to be there for them. And I think CMPD does a good job, and they're doing a better job of helping officers find resources and deal with their problems too, because they can't go out and police the community if they're suffering the same ills themselves. Absolutely.
Do you all have and I'm just asking, curious now, an employee assistance program or some sort of internal structure that allows them?
There is, and actually our county manager has stepped up, and she's assisting us with growing a program, in hopes that we'll have a clinical director that'll be involved with the CMPD soon that will help assist people both internally and externally with their mental health issues.
Very nice, very nice. As we're wrapping up, are there any new events coming up with NAMI that you want to tell everyone about?
Well, we do have the Stomp Out the Stigma ride, the Green Ribbon Ride, which is a motorcycle ride that's occurring this Saturday. It starts at Harley-Davidson at Charlotte, which is in Matthews. At 10 o'clock, and we ride up to Speedway Harley-Davidson. It's a fundraiser, but all the money is geared towards providing direct services to people in the community.
Very nice. Are you going to be on a Harley too?
No, I won't be there. I'll be serving chicken sandwiches.
Okay. So the Stomp Out the Stigma, Harley-Davidson ride, and that's going to be where again?
It starts at Charlotte Harley-Davidson, which is in Matthews, at 10 o'clock, 10 a.m. on Saturday morning.
Awesome. And again, you said NAMI.org is the website that you can go to. NAMI is NAMI. Stands for National Alliance for Mental Illness. And people can go to NAMI.org and put in their local city to find resources that might be offered for mental illness.
Join NAMI, get regular follow-up information from NAMI. There's great information throughout we learn from our friends throughout the country, and NAMI has a great resource and a great contact list throughout the country to help us get this information out.
Wonderful. Thank you for joining me in the studio today.
Thank you for the opportunity.
You're so welcome. I'm your host, Dr. Melissa Tate. You've been listening to Meditate and Mingle with my co-host and guest today, Deputy Chief Officer Levins. Thank you for joining me today on WDRB Media and WGIV, the soul of Charlotte.